That was one of the songs that we sang on the mission trip a few times. I have never thought of myself as a runner, but when I was 33 years old, I decided to try running. After being inspired by my husband Brad, who'd run several half and full marathons, I set the goal to run a half marathon when I was 35. Because I'm not what you would call a natural runner, and I don't actually enjoy running at all, I found friends who would train with me, and I followed a rigid training plan that outlined how often I was to run each week and how long. And along the way, some of my friends got injured and had to stop running, but I kept going, focused on the goal. And eventually my race day came, and I ran my first and probably only half marathon. I was really proud of myself, mostly because I did something that went against my nature. I ran, even though I didn't start running until I was over 30. And I followed a disciplined training regimen that prepared me. And to be honest, that is the only reason I crossed the finish line. I could not have run that race without the training. And I think training for a race is a helpful metaphor for our primary text this morning. If we think of loving others as a journey that we train for, it doesn't seem quite as impossible and difficult. And let's turn to our primary text this morning, Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, beginning at chapter 12, verse 31. But strive for the greater gifts, and I will show you a still more excellent way. If I speak in the tongues of mortals and of angels, but do not have love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give away all my possessions, and if I hand over my body so that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. This is the word of the Lord. Now, are you looking around wondering where the bride and groom are? Most often, this text is read at weddings, but the most appropriate context, the context that it was actually written for, is the church. Paul had a challenging and complicated relationship with the Corinthian church. There's evidence of that in both letters. Throughout the first letter to the Corinthians, Paul addresses specific issues and questions raised at the church in Corinth. Some of them pretty scandalous if you go back and look. Paul's response in all the various situations is guided by self-sacrificing love. This letter to the Corinthians culminates in this chapter. In fact, each of Paul's metaphors and negative descriptors of love in this section, for example, that love isn't boastful, arrogant, or rude, can be tied back to a previous part of the letter where Paul is addressing an issue. Paul is essentially telling the Corinthians that love is exactly the opposite of how they have been behaving and treating one another. How would you like to get that letter? What Paul asks the Corinthians and us to do is to love one another perfectly and sacrificially. Imagine what it would be like if we were to live this out. How would our relationships at home and at church be transformed if we were always patient, kind, never envious, boastful, or rude? What if we didn't insist on our own way, but let the other person have their way? What if we weren't irritable or resentful, but instead forgave one another and showed one another grace? And how do we do all that without losing ourselves or being a doormat? Although this text may be one of the most beautiful descriptions of love, it's also really troubling because it's an impossible standard to meet. It's a nice idea, and we'd all like to think that we can love one another that well, But the truth is that we know ourselves well enough to know that we fail miserably all the time. In fact, I'm guessing some of us failed this morning just getting to church. The truth is that only God could love that perfectly. And that's the point. We are shown this type of love through the example of Jesus Christ in the way he lived and also in his sacrificial death on our behalf, putting what we need before himself. Human nature is to respond exactly how the Corinthians did, to be envious, boastful, arrogant, rude, to insist on our own way, to be irritable, to keep a running list of all the wrongs done against us. So just like it was not in my nature to run, it's not in human nature to love perfectly and unselfishly. At the beginning of our text, Paul sets up the description of love by saying, "I will show you a still more excellent way." The Greek words used for "I will show you" could also be translated, "I will describe a journey," which implies learning to love others is not immediate. It happens over time. A still more excellent way has been difficult to translate from Greek because the way it's worded doesn't make sense in Greek. Another translation of that phrase is a mountain pass, which the Greeks used to train for races. They would run hills, mountain passes, to build their endurance and speed. If we use this translation, we understand that loving in a self-sacrificing way takes intentional training and endurance. No one accidentally runs a mountain pass. It's done intentionally and with a purpose. And most runners here would tell you that running hills isn't their favorite type of training, but they do it because it makes them a better runner. I like these translations better because it gives us hope and grace that we can get better at loving one another, but it will take discipline and training. In our first scripture reading, which was our theme verse for the youth mission trip, Paul gives us examples of how to practice loving, how we can train and build our endurance to love one another. I'll read it again, but this time I'm going to read it in the Message translation. Love from the center of who you are. Don't fake it. Run for dear life from evil. Hold on for dear life to good. Be good friends who love deeply. Practice playing second fiddle. Don't burn out. Keep yourselves fueled and aflame. Be alert servants of the Master, cheerfully expectant. Don't quit in hard times. Pray all the harder. Help needy Christians. Be inventive in hospitality. Youth mission trips are a great way to train to love others. On mission trips, we put ourselves in situations that are vastly different than what we're used to on a daily basis, and we meet people that we otherwise might not be around. For example, nearly every day while we were in Washington, D.C., we met homeless people and intentionally cared for them. Students learned names, listened to and cared for the people who are ignored by the majority of the population that lives in Washington. They showed them honor and respect as children of God. It can also be challenging and exhausting to live in close quarters with others for a week. Yet the students were patient and kind with one another. Even when they were exhausted, they went out of their way to welcome one another and made an effort to include everyone. While we were there, students learned more about what is evil and what is good in the world, and the call to stand up against what is evil, even if it doesn't affect them directly. Because we were on a mission trip, we were aware every day that we were servants of Jesus, being the hands and feet of Jesus with our actions. When we met with representatives and talked with the Presbyterian Office of Public Witness, we were reminded that as people work in different ways against evil in the world and seek justice in different ways, that ultimately our hope is found in Jesus. What we saw reminded us of the need to pray fervently for those who are suffering, those close to us, and those throughout the world. Through the organizations we served with, we saw the importance of everyone contributing to the needs of others, Nonprofits that serve the least of these and the most vulnerable in our society need our support, both financially and personally. We were extended hospitality while we were in Washington by the organizations we served with, the church we stayed in, and the people we met. We also extended hospitality to those that we served in various organizations when we served meals, gave out clothing items, and welcomed and learned from various speakers. Youth mission trips are sort of like the Greeks intentionally running mountain passes to train for a race, and the leaders will tell you just as exhausting. Mission trips are a week-long, intense training session on how to love others, meant to prepare us for how to practice loving back home. One thing we learned on this mission trip is that there are plenty of opportunities to practice loving and living out our faith here at home. We can choose to be vulnerable enough to really care for and love others deeply, especially those that we naturally want to keep our distance from. We can all stand up against what is evil in the world in a variety of ways and choose to do what is good and right when we're presented the opportunity. We can show loving affection to one another and how we treat, speak to, and about one another by showing each other honor and respect, not gossiping and assuming the best instead of the worst about another person's intentions. We can let other people shine, lift others up, and encourage them. We can choose to remind ourselves each day that we serve the Lord. I know people who remind themselves of this before they even get out of bed in the morning, and others who put a sticky note on their mirror to remind them. We should remember that our hope is found in Jesus and rejoice in that hope when we begin to feel hopeless with what we see is happening in the world. We should be patient when we suffer, not prone to give up. We need to persevere in prayer for one another and the world. And it's important to note here that the word that Paul uses for persevere doesn't mean pray when you remember or feel like it. It means to pray intentionally. Go out of your way to pray. We can contribute to the needs of others. When someone is in need and we're in a place to give, we need to give. We heard about an opportunity last week during the Moment for Mission. We can donate shoes to Mission Community Outreach Center or volunteer our time. And I'm sure there's plenty of other opportunities you can read about in the bulletin or out there. Finally, we can extend hospitality to strangers. I like how the Message puts it. Be inventive in hospitality. Find ways to welcome others into your life, into your home, into your workplace, and especially into the church. Loving others is not simply a feeling, but it's an action. It doesn't come naturally much of the time, but instead requires practice, training, and intention, just like training for a race by running mountain passes. It's important to remember that training takes time and planning. You don't run a mountain pass your first day of running. You start with shorter runs, and you work your way up to long runs and big hills. We have ample opportunity each day to practice loving with our family, those we live and work with, strangers we encounter in our daily lives, and our brothers and sisters in Christ in the church. Ask where God or who God is calling you to train to love. Start with small but intentional acts. Invite someone you don't know very well out for coffee or into your home, showing hospitality. Or volunteer to work at the shoe drive and meet a whole new population of people to love right here in Spokane. See where the Spirit leads and how you learn to love. But when you're discouraged, because we can't do it perfectly, remember that the one who loves perfectly is God. But by the grace of God, we are given an example in Jesus Christ, and we're empowered and equipped by the Spirit of God to live out that love in the world.